Welcome back to the Nerdy Grail, and a video that was a long time in the making. Yes, way back in September, I think on September 22nd actually, I uploaded a video ranking every regeneration story of Doctor Who from worst to best, where I did all of them from the 10th planet all the way up to the Giggle, so from William Hartnell to Ncuti Gatwa. And I did keep in mind that I think at the same time, I would like to also do a post-regeneration list as well, because they're just as important as a regeneration list. And like I said, regeneration is one of the core concepts of Doctor Who. That's why it's able to survive as long as it did. So I've got a couple of my collection box sets behind me. I'm rocking out my Tom Baker 4th Doctor shirt again. Love the 4th Doctor. And yeah, regeneration. This is the regeneration set, is a core aspect of Doctor Who. And so in this video, I'm going to be ranking all the post-regeneration stories from Doctor Who, from worst to best, in my personal opinion. Now, I've got a bit of a success criteria when it comes to post-regeneration stories, because post-regeneration stories are just as, if not more important than regeneration stories, because post-regeneration stories obviously are the first story of a new incarnation, so you're supposed to introduce that incarnation, and for most people it might be a starting point for when they're joining into the show, so it's really important that you get these right. So my success criteria for what I count as a good regeneration story, there has to be 4 main things for me. So that's what I'm judging the stories based on. Not necessarily whether I think the stories are good or bad, but whether they hit this criteria ideally. So the first thing is, in my opinion, I feel like it has to explain the concept of regeneration well, or at least decent enough for an audience. The audience has to sort of know what the Doctor's talking about in terms of regeneration. It can't just be like a pass-off line just randomly here for the audience to go, wait, what's he talking about? They got to be able to explain it to whoever they're joining on their adventures, to their new companion, and maybe to the audience as well. Both for people who have watched the show during the previous incarnation, and then those who are joining the show now, so they know what to expect potentially later on. So it sort of teases and gets the audience involved. So that's one thing that's in my criteria. The second thing for my criteria, the story has to put the Doctor in a situation that's sort of designed for their predecessor, but they have to try and tackle it themselves. So for the best example, I think personally, is something like Robot with Planet of the Spiders. That is definitely a John Pertwee story, but because obviously the Doctor has unfortunately had to regenerate, Tom Baker has to do it instead of John Pertwee. So I think it's good to do that, so then you can demonstrate how the new incarnation is different to the previous. So that is my second criteria. It has to be designed ideally for the predecessor, but the successor is the one who has to tackle the challenge. The third thing, it has to allow the audience to connect with the new Doctor. You can't just have the Doctor be absent in their first story, because they are the new Doctor, they are the new lead. You need to allow the audience to truly connect with them on some form of a level, so you know what you're getting in for. So if they fail to do that, then for me, that's not a great post-regeneration story. And the fourth thing, there needs to be a bit of a balanced threat, because obviously this is a new Doctor, they're a bit all over the place. The threat needs to be a little bit intense, just to keep the audience engaged and to test this new Doctor, but also nothing too extreme, you know? So like a mid-level threat, if I'm being honest, personally. So they're like the 4 main criteria. But before I jump into this ranking video, and I know this has been a bit of a long rambly thing, I will say that I'm only ranking, there's 13 stories that I'm ranking on this list, and there's some Doctors that won't appear. For example, I can't put An Earthly Child on it because that's not a post-regeneration story. And I won't be putting stories like The Night of the Doctor or Day of the Doctor really on this list either. And there is some stories that will overlap from my regeneration story as well, because when I talk about post-regeneration, I'm talking about the first time you see them on screen and they have either a full-on story or they have a decent bit of screen time where they can do the reaction to themselves properly. So the Giggle will appear on this list again, because for me, Ncuti is in it enough and reacts enough about his appearance to warrant it being a post-regeneration story, so to speak. But let's waste no more time now. I've rambled on long enough, and let's jump straight in to this ranking of every post-regeneration story in Doctor Who, from worst to best, in my personal opinion. Right, okay, so coming in at number 13, last on my list, is in fact Doctor Who, The Giggle. Yeah, The Giggle appeared on my regeneration list. It's also appearing on my post-regeneration list. In my opinion, The Giggle is the worst regeneration story. Should I tell you why? Because it's not even a proper regeneration story, and so the post-regeneration is then really poor. It's a bi-regeneration. Because the one thing as well that I should have added before to a post-regeneration is you've said goodbye to the previous Doctor. Well, the previous Doctor's still around. So it's hard to say goodbye and hard to then get that new connection to the new guy. But Ncuti appears only in the last 20 minutes of this story, so it feels quite rushed. In terms of it being a balanced threat, it is definitely not. The Toymaker, probably one of the most extreme threats you could have, and they sort of defeat him far too easily when Ncuti comes around. Ncuti's not really given much time to fully connect with us as an audience in that story because we've got so much going on. We've got the Toymaker, we've got the Master's Tooth, we've got Kate, we've got Mel, we've got Donna, we've got the Doctor splitting two TARDISes, we've got references galore. So it's really difficult to connect to the new guy when you're being bombarded with so many Easter eggs. It is absolutely ridiculous. It does a terrible job at explaining regeneration to us because they introduce then bi-regeneration, so complicating things even more, talking about it that it's a myth, it shouldn't happen. That's just really confusing, especially if, say, that was your first ever regeneration, you know, and then putting the Doctor in a story that's meant for his predecessor. It's weird because his predecessor's still there, so it doesn't really tick any of the boxes for me for a proper post-regeneration. And then the next time you see the 15th Doctor in the church on Ruby Road, he's pretty much fully established by then, so he doesn't get then a proper post-regeneration. So, in my opinion, The Giggle, for me, is the worst post-regeneration story of all of Doctor Who, at least in my personal opinion, and that's why it's at number 13 on the list. So coming in at number 12, this one might shock a few people, we have Rose from Series 1. Now, before we all jump to conclusions, let me explain myself. Firstly, Rose as a story is a fairly decent story. I like the story of Rose. It's quite a fun one. So I don't hate the story by any means. It's a good story. In fact, most of Season 1 is spot on perfect. But as a post-regeneration story, it's a bit odd. And it's a little bit complicated because this can technically count as a post-regeneration story, but also technically not. The reason I've put this on the list as a post-regeneration story is because the Doctor does have a moment in the story where he clearly has only just seen his face for the first time. He's in Rose's apartment, he's talking to Rose, he's in the other room playing with the cards, he notices his face in the mirror, and he does the Tom Baker, all sorts of Doctors look, where they've looked in a mirror, and he goes, could have been worse. Look at the ears. You know, so he is noticing his face for the first time as if he is just regenerated. Obviously, due to Big Finish, that's sort of a bit up in the air. But that was enough for me to be able to put this on the list because he has a post-regeneration moment. So in terms of the criteria, well, it doesn't really explain regeneration at all. Like I said, you'd be a bit confused as to why he's looking in the mirror and looking confused at his face, and they never bring that up again until he obviously regenerates at the end of Season 1. In terms of putting the Doctor in the story for their predecessor, I mean, definitely not, because Eccleston's predecessor was John Hurt, the War Doctor, and I don't think it would have suited him at all. So definitely not. Allow you to connect with the Doctor? I would say it does do that quite well, to be fair. You do really get an idea of the Ninth Doctor's character in this story, so they do that pretty well. I love the Ninth Doctor. He's brilliant. He's got a good charm. He's got the anger. He's got the heroism, you know. He's brilliant with it all. I love it. Fantastic. In terms of a balanced threat, well, you've got the Autons. And the Autons, they are a decent level threat, but I would say I'd class the Autons as sort of that mid-threat, really. So I'd say in terms of threat level, decent job there. So 2 out of my 4 criteria is not too bad, which is why it's not bottom last. But yeah, there's some elements to me that just doesn't really make sense. And yeah, it's not very good in terms of explaining regeneration to an audience, especially for new and old fans. So that's why it's at 12th place on this list. But don't get me wrong, I think Rose is a fantastic story. And coming in at number 11 on the list, this is one that I think people might have expected to come bottom, but it doesn't because of stories like Rose and the Giggle. But coming in at number 11 is the twin dilemma, Colin Baker's first story. And yet, following on from the Kaiser Androzani was always going to be a difficult task, going from one of the best stories ever to debatably one of the worst. It wasn't a good idea to tag on Colin Baker's first story right after that one, especially when they knew how they wrote the Doctor in that one, and everything about that story just screams red flag and wrong, if I'm being perfectly honest. It's an entertaining story, don't get me wrong. I find it thoroughly entertaining. But in terms of like quality and how it fits my criteria, it does it in a pretty bad way. So like firstly, explaining the concept of regeneration to an audience, it does it all right, especially since you've got Perry, who's just followed on from Peter into Colin. So he does sort of explain it. He sort of, he says like change, renewal, he does explain what the process is about. But obviously he goes through another one of the regeneration is failing. And he says stuff like, regenerate, yet unregenerate. So it's a complicated one. But also at the same time, it is a little bit confusing for some new fans as well. So they do it okay, but not great. Putting the Doctor in a situation that's designed for his predecessor, I would say yes and no. I feel like Peter would have done saving the twins and defeating Mestor just as well as Colin did. But if I'm being honest, like the Sixth Doctor is really all over the place in the Twin Dilemma, so I don't really think it shows his character very well, especially since, yes, the Sixth Doctor is a little bit full of himself all the time. He's very vain, he can be a little bit aggressive, but he's too overly aggressive in the Twin Dilemma, and he's not really like that for the rest of his era. He has moments where he's extremely aggressive, like you'll see stuff like Shockeye in the Two Doctors and stuff like that. Yes, he does have those moments, but it's a little bit more over the top in the Twin Dilemma. Allowing the audience to connect with the Doctor, it doesn't do that at all. If anything, it puts people off the Doctor because it makes the Doctor out to be a villain and a horrible person who treats his companion like rubbish, abuses them. I mean, the Doctor even says that in the story. I spent the day, using, abusing, even trying to kill you. And is that supposed to be your hero? It's like, yeah, so it does that terribly, absolutely awful. Balanced threat, I think it goes too far the other way. Mestor's not a threat at all. He's like an easy target, really. So it doesn't allow the Doctor to truly shine. And that's one of the big problems with the Twin Dilemma. And just the story itself is a bit boring. When you're not seeing the Sixth Doctor flip out, you're going over to these twins who are boring and dull. I'm sorry, they are terrible. So that's why the Twin Dilemma is so low on this list, coming in at number 11. Just breaking the top 10 spot is another story that people thought would be probably a bit lower on the list, but yes, it is here. We have got the Time and the Rani for the Seventh Doctor, the Seventh Doctor's post-regeneration story. Now, yeah, I don't mind Time and the Rani. I think it's because it's so wacky and so weird. I find that quite entertaining. You get to see the eccentric side of this Doctor, and the Seventh Doctor is very eccentric, especially at the start. So I think it does do that pretty well. So it's fun, and it is fun, and it's really light-hearted, especially considering that the Sixth Doctor's era was a lot more dark and gritty, and there was even blood and stuff in it. So it's a very different tone. So I think that wasn't too bad to show the change in the Doctor himself, going from this more aggressive form to a more goofball form, even though the Seventh Doctor's known for his manipulation, which he does get as seasons go on. But Time the Rani, it does explain regeneration decently well-ish. He does sort of talk about it with Mel and mention that obviously he's changed his appearance. He talks about it to the Rani when she's pretending to be Mel. He has lots of moments where he checks out his appearance. He has a full-on dress-up montage where he wears costumes from previous incarnations. So it is a bit of fun. So for audiences, they do sort of get an idea of what regeneration is. And if I'm being honest, from here on out on the list, regeneration is kind of at least partly explained, so that's not too bad. Putting the Doctor in a situation deemed for his predecessor, for this story in particular, 100% yes. Time of the Rani was 100% meant for Colin Baker. There was even talks about it that they wanted, obviously, Colin Baker to come back for a Regeneration story, which was going to be Time of the Rani. But obviously, due to everything that went on, the firing of Colin Baker, he refused, and I don't blame him for doing so. So they had to shoehorn in his regeneration at the start of the story. So yeah, 100% was made for Colin, but obviously Sylvester McCoy took charge of that, and you could see how the Seventh Doctor dealt with it. It would have been interesting to see Colin deal with it, but 100% you could see how the Seventh Doctor's personality is incorporated into the story. Allowing you to connect with the Doctor, I think it does very well, because he has moments where he can show his temper, so you know that he's got that darker side. He's very goofy, much the clown like previous incarnations like the Second Doctor. So you do get to connect with the Seventh Doctor fairly well in this story. And in terms of a balanced threat, see, the Rani, you know, being a Time Lord, and you'd think like she would be like the same big threat as like the Master or something. But because the Rani's so underused, bring her back in New Who, please. I would say she is a fairly balanced threat. You know, she's not exactly like Mestor levels of bad, but I'd say she's like on the level of the Autons, you know, enough to where you hear her name and you're like, oh God, we need to do something, but not enough to where you're like, oh no, the world is over. So I think it does do well for the first story of the Seventh Doctor, and they bounce off each other really, really well. Is it a great story? Not really. But is it a fun story? I'd say it is. Just give it a chance. Sure, it's not the best, but it's definitely not the worst. That goes to the twin dilemma for the classic series anyway. But that's why it's at number 10 on the list. And coming in at number 9, we have got The Woman Who Fell to Earth, Jodie Whittaker's post-regeneration story. Now, yeah, I know there'll probably be a few people going, what? Why is she so high, especially compared to some of the others? Look, don't get me wrong. Yes, the Chris Chibnall era wasn't the best. But when I look back on it, I find myself revisiting it a little bit more, and I don't think it's as bad as what we all made out to be. I think we were just a bit harsh on it. And to be fair, regardless of how bad season 11 is, because it's still definitely the worst season in New Who for me, The Woman Who Fell to Earth, her first story, I thought was actually not too bad. And in terms of the criteria, it does fairly well on most of the points, if I'm being honest. Like, for example, it does sort of explain the concept of regeneration, because she's constantly talking about how she was a man before. She explains it, to Graham. They start talking about how, there's this moment where they feel like they're going to die. Their whole body is bubbling and changing and reforming. And so she does explain it. It doesn't explain it greatly, but she does allow an audience who's just joined the show to know, something has happened and you are different for it. So we do get that, and you get to see, post-regeneration stuff. So it is explained okay. In terms of putting the Doctor in something that was meant for the predecessor, considering that apparently Chris Chibnall wanted Peter Capaldi to stay on, I could honestly see Peter Capaldi doing this and doing that story, and I think he would do it pretty well. And getting to see how this Doctor's now got to adapt because she's changed, because she now doesn't have the sonic screwdriver, which would have been in her pocket, which she wanted to use on multiple occasions to get out of scrapes. When she does the big jump between the cranes and, misjumps a little bit because she remembered her legs being longer. It was definitely written with that in mind. And so I think, yes, it does tick that box, in my opinion. Allowing you to connect with the new Doctor. Yes, you do actually connect with the new Doctor on multiple levels. You get to see how they're different now. You get to see how the Doctor's trying to adapt to being a woman now. They do that decently well. And in terms of a balanced threat, Tim Shaw, sure, he's not the most, threatening of villains, but I would say he's balanced enough to where for a new Doctor, trying to get themselves back out there, I think it does work. So I'm going to give The Woman Who Fell to Earth some credit, and that's why it's up at number 9, because it's not awful, if I'm being perfectly honest, and I don't mind rewatching it. It's a little bit of fun. Sure, it's not great, but it does what it needs to do okay. So that's why it's at number 9 on the list. Coming in at number 8, we've got the first post-regeneration story in Doctor Who, The Power of the Daleks. So William Hartnell has now become Patrick Troughton. So for the very first ever post-regeneration story, it's very bizarre because obviously at the time they weren't really sure what they wanted to do. And obviously they sort of had to change the actor due to the show still being popular and wanting to continue it, but obviously Hartnell was too ill to continue, so he needed to be replaced. And so it was a bit hit or miss as to how they were going to explain what had happened. So they sort of go along the idea that, I remember the second Doctor saying, like, he's been renewed and, life, is based on renewal and change. He has moments where he looks in a mirror, he sees himself as Hartnell, but actually he then turns to Troutman. You do get to see how his personality is different, because there's multiple times in the story where he refuses to call himself the Doctor. There's even a moment where you've got Ben and Polly in the TARDIS at the start, and he's trying on like the Hartnell ring and all sorts, and they say, "See, you are the Doctor then." And him seeing himself in the mirror, he's like, "Well, I don't look like him," that sort of thing. So he's like refusing to believe he's the Doctor. So it is an interesting take on it, but they don't dwell on it too much. And it is moments where he sort of remembers he's the Doctor, then decides to refuse to be the Doctor. So it's done in a really bizarre way. Does it explain the concept of regeneration well enough for a new audience? Yes and no. I can't say it fully does, because this was the first time it happened, and so it wasn't really coined as regeneration properly then. It was just sort of this weird change that happened so that the actor could be replaced. So kind of, but not exactly. Does it put the Doctor in a story designed for his predecessor? I'd say 100%, because Hartnell is known for his interactions with the Daleks. And William Hartnell definitely could have done this story, and it would have fit very well. But obviously, because it's Troutman, you got to see a bit of a different angle to the story, so I think they do that really well. Does it allow you to connect with the new Doctor? Yeah, because you get to see how eccentric and weird he is compared to Hartnell. The grandfather's now gone, and you've got this like weird, clown character. So it is vastly different, especially with that massive hat he has. I still find that bizarre. And it does allow you to connect with him really well. In terms of a balanced threat, though, I think for a first story, making it be the Daleks is really interesting. You can't get a much bigger threat than the Daleks as your first story. But I know why they did it. They sort of did it because, they wanted to see how audiences would take to a new Doctor, but they wanted to give them something familiar, and Ben and Polly were still fairly new companions, so the audience couldn't really connect with them very well. So if you bring the Daleks back, it sort of gives the audience that grab to come back. So is it a balanced threat? Not really. I'd say it's a bit overpowered, but at the time, there was a reason behind using the Daleks. But yeah, that is why the Power of the Daleks is at number 8, because it ticks all the boxes, but it's probably in one of the strangest ways of the whole show's history. But that's just down to it being the first time it was done. But that is why Power of the Daleks is at number 8. So, coming in at number 7, we have the 10th Doctor's post-regeneration story, The Christmas Invasion. Now, yeah, this is a bit of a weird one. Obviously, this was the first post-regeneration story then of New Who, and so they wanted to do it in a way to sort of show how much this change really means to companions, to the Doctor, and how it can change the show, whether for better or for worse. And they do it in a fairly decent way. I would say, in terms of the criteria, it does explain the concept regeneration well, because the Ninth Doctor explained it before he changed in the previous story. There's then a mini short that came out for Children in Need that also explains the regeneration. And then throughout this story, the Doctor does sprinkle little bits and pieces about the regeneration, especially when he's woken up due to an attack by the Christmas tree, and he says that his body is still fixing itself, still repairing, and he woke him up too soon. And you get to see at one point, obviously, his hand gets chopped off by the Sycorax, and because he's still healing, he's able to bring his hand back. So they do sprinkle bits and pieces throughout for the audience to remind them, if you haven't seen the previous season or you haven't seen the short beforehand. Putting the Doctor in a situation that's designed for the previous incarnation, yeah, Christopher Eccleston 100% could have done this story. 100%, especially, since his familiar surroundings with Rose and Jackie and Mickey, in London. The Ninth Doctor spent a lot of his era down on Earth with them, dealing with alien threats. So you easily could have done this story with the Ninth Doctor. Would have been dealt with a lot quicker, because the 10th Doctor does spend a lot of this story in bed. Which brings me on to my next point. Does it allow the audience to connect with the Doctor? See, it's really weird, because like I said, he spends probably about nearly 3/4 of the story tucked up in bed, not actually doing anything, meaning that you're not actually getting to know what this incarnation's about. But when he does appear on the screen, you fully get what this Doctor's about. You get that he's definitely more human. You know, he wants to do things. He's a hugger. He likes to go to the Christmas dinners. You know, he wears a more normal outfit to make himself seem more like a human. You know, the 10th Doctor suit is the most basic of all the Doctor Who costumes, if I'm honest. But yeah, he is very human. But also you can tell that there's a dark side to him, like when he doesn't give the Sycorax leader a second chance and just, well, sends him to his death. He's very eccentric, so he's got elements from previous Doctors, so you know what the 10th Doctor's about. And I do think people did connect with him fairly well. So I'd say it does it okay, but not the best, because yeah, he does spend most of the story practically unconscious. In terms of a balanced threat, kinda, yeah, I'd say, yeah, the Sycorax are sort of a balanced threat, really. But to be fair, the Doctor didn't really deal with that threat for most of the story. It was more the companions dealing with it. But still, at the same time, he is the one to save the day. And I think it was done alright. I like the Christmas Invasion. It's a bit of a fun story. So that's why Christmas Invasion comes in at number 7 on the list. Just missing out on the top 5 spot, coming in at number 6, is Castrovalva. And can we just take a moment just, to have our thoughts for Peter Davison, please? Because he had probably one of the hardest jobs ever after, obviously, Patrick Troughton taking over from the first Doctor. He probably had the next hardest job because not only was he the youngest actor to play the Doctor at the time, meaning that, you had a bunch of elder actors playing the Doctor and then you've got a young'un, and so he had that to contend with. But he also had to take over from Tom Baker, someone who's still to this day considered as the iconic Doctor. Tom's still my favourite Doctor, hence why I rock out the shirt. But Tom Baker is still considered to be the Doctor, and he was the longest running Doctor and still is, with over 7 years in the role. So he had a lot to fill. And so he did, I think, a fantastic job, considering the circumstances. I love Peter Davison. He does do a really good job. In terms of Castrovalva as a story, it's an alright story. It's a bit of a fun one. The first 2 parts fully take place on the TARDIS, and then the last 2 parts take place in Castrovalva. So you get a lot of time with the new Doctor. It does explain the concept of regeneration fairly well, because obviously this continues straight on from Logopolis, and so the Doctor does talk about regeneration. They introduce the Zero Room, which will help a Time Lord refocus themselves, re-energize themselves when they're hurt, or maybe through regeneration. They introduce this place called Castrovalva, but we think that, that's just because of Adric and the Master messing around. But a place where a Time Lord can go if they're suffering with post-regeneration sickness, pretty much. It does explain what happens to regeneration, that there is a change. It's the first time that the regeneration is also failing, because that then starts to become a frequent thing later on down the line, that the Doctor suffers traumatic regenerations that cause him to, be sick or to be weird or something to happen. So it's an interesting way to go about it. It does, I would 100% say that sort of the 4th Doctor could have done this story, but if I'm being honest, this is probably the first time on this list where I feel like maybe not. I feel like this story was sort of, this is a Peter Davison story, not a Tom Baker story, because I even feel like Logopolis is not a Tom Baker story. I think Logopolis is a Peter Davison story that just so happens to have Tom Baker in it. So yeah, it's the first time on this list where I actually think, no, it doesn't tick that box. But you do get to see, obviously, how different Peter is to Tom. I mean, Tom, towards the end of his era, was a little bit more tired and fed up. But Peter, obviously, is a bit more energised, and, he's got that youthfulness to him where he can run around a lot more than Tom could by the end. You do get to connect with this Doctor, especially in parts 1 and 2 when he's on board the TARDIS. He's doing all his post-regeneration silliness. It is a bit of fun. When he's in Castrovalva, he sort of takes more of a back seat to being a bit more, laid back and resting. But you do get to see his charm, his passive-aggressive nature come through a lot. It is quite nice sometimes to see. Especially when he's trying to learn how to count and this little kid comes over to him to tell him that, 3 comes after 2. And then as in terms of a balanced threat, well, the threat's the Master. So, I mean, it kind of was a bit of an OP threat, but he sort of could handle it, really, to be perfectly honest. And to be fair, the Master doesn't really do a lot in Castrovalva, if I'm honest. So it's here or neither here nor there really. But yeah, Castroval was a fairly decent story. I quite like it. But yeah, it just misses out on that top 5 spot, coming in at number 6. So, breaking the top 5, we have got the Doctor Who TV movie starring good old Paul McGann as the 8th Doctor. Yeah, this was also in my regeneration list because of the fact that Sylvester McCoy is in this and has a regeneration scene. But this time we can talk a little bit more about the whole movie as a whole, really. And I have a soft spot for this movie. I know a lot of people aren't a huge fan of it. It is the most different in terms of the whole Doctor Who collection. That's because it was trying to cater to a new audience. It was taking the show in a new direction, trying to revive it, ready for a series, hopefully with in America, but which didn't fully take off. But I still like it, and I think it's a bit of fun. So this story, I think, does explain regeneration really, really well. Because this whole story is just about regeneration. Because it's about survival for the Master. And so he wants to steal the Doctor's remaining regenerations. So they are explaining regeneration constantly in this story. From obviously right at the beginning where they say that the Master's used all of his lives. You know, how he's trying to find a way of survival, how the 7th Doctor gets shot down and so regenerates, so then the 8th Doctor has to explain regeneration. They do post-regeneration amnesia. The 8th Doctor explains it to Grace. The Master explains regeneration to Lee. He tries to steal the Doctor's regenerations. You know, there is so much explanation on regeneration in this story. I think, debatably, this is the best for that. It does it really, really well. So I really like it for that. It puts the Doctor in a situation designed for his predecessor. I mean, kind of-ish. I mean, I could see the 7th Doctor dealing with this, but I don't know. It's a bit of an odd one. There's a bit of a grey cloud over that, if I'm honest. I think McCoy could have done it. He would have done it quicker, I think, because, you know, the 7th Doctor was very manipulative. I don't think he would have fallen for some of the things that the 8th Doctor does, especially the romantic stuff, because this is where the romantic stuff kicks in. But yeah, I could kind of see it. It does sort of fit late McCoy, but it would have been over quite quickly, I think. You do get to connect with the new Doctor. You do get to see that he's a more of a romantic, flirty character, you know, that Englishman in New York, so to speak. You know, he is that alien. It is very different. And I like Paul McGann. He does really, really well. And I'm gutted we've not had a full series with him. We deserve to have that. And in terms of balanced threat, I mean, the threat is real in this story. The Master goes ham. Like, it is a proper threat for the Doctor, especially in a post-regeneration story. So I don't think it was a balanced threat at all. The Master's going ham on the Doctor in this story. So, I don't know. I don't think it does that very well. But I can't deny, this story definitely, for me, if you're a new fan and you want to know about regeneration, the TV movie does it in a fairly good way. Not a perfect way, because it does bombard you with a lot of information. But you do get a nice detailed idea about regeneration in this story. So for that reason, it comes in at number 5 on the list. Coming in at number 4, we have Spearhead from Space. So the post-regeneration story for Jon Pertwee. So it's transitioned into colour. Brand new era of the show. Obviously, we recently just had the War Games in colour, which finally got us to see Troughton become Jon Pertwee in an interesting and unique way. And Spearhead from Space is, for many people, considered quite a cult classic story, and is actually a pretty decent way to start the show, if I'm honest, for a new audience. Because you get that sort of reboot, but you also get that familiarity as well. And I think the Jon Pertwee era is a good place to start for any Whovian. Start with Jon Pertwee, you'll have a blast. But it does explain regeneration to a degree, especially since you've got the return of the Brigadier, who travelled with, well, didn't travel, but encountered the 2nd Doctor on numerous occasions, and so has to adapt to a new face for the Doctor. So the Doctor does have to briefly explain what the change is to the Brigadier, and you know, to the audience as well, really. So they do that okay. Does it put the Doctor in a situation designed for his previous incarnation? I think Troughton would have been able to do it, and it wouldn't be the first time that he's teamed up with UNIT, so I could have seen it. But I think what does help this story go is the 3rd Doctor does take things a little bit more seriously than the 2nd Doctor does. And so I think that does help him more. So I actually think it would have been more of a hindrance to still have the second Doctor around in this story, if I'm being perfectly honest. And I'm not sure the second Doctor would have connected very well with Liz. So I think having the third Doctor for this one actually as well, it benefits the change, if I'm honest. You do connect with John Pertwee very well in this story. You get to see his caring nature. You get to see his new fighting techniques that he's gathered now, because he's one for martial arts and Venusian Aikido. I love all that. He is very cheeky as well. He's very sarcastic. I love some of his comments. He's funny. And that is just John Pertwee to a T. He's brilliant. I love it. And balanced threat, well, you got the Autons, and this was the first appearance of the Autons. Decent threat, I think, you know, and at the time they hadn't really been established properly. So in terms of a threat, I think the third Doctor did very well, and it was fairly balanced. So for me, that is why Spearhead from Space comes in at number 4 on the list. So, getting the bronze medal is the 11th Hour. So, the 11th Doctor's post-regeneration story. And I think it is a fantastic story. A thoroughly entertaining one. It's probably the story that I come back to watch the most out of all of season 5. I think it is done really, really well. And it ticks a lot of the boxes in a good way for me. So, for example, like, explain the concept of regeneration. It really does do that to a degree. He's constantly making little snide comments about his regeneration and the fact he's changed. Like, especially when Amy Pond, when he comes back to visit Amy Pond, when she's grown up and she whacks him across the head with a baseball bat. And he just makes a little snide comment saying, "Brand new me, whack on the head, just what I needed." You know, he constantly mentions that he's changed and he's got a new face now. He has the post-regeneration stuff, you know, he talks about how the regeneration stuff is normal to the little girl version of Amelia. At the end of the story, you get to see all the previous faces of the Doctor, apart from the War Doctor, because he hadn't been established yet. But yeah, you get to see all that. So it is really, really nice. They do it in a nice whimsical way, I feel like. And that's how I could sum up the Matt Smith era in general. It's a very whimsical era of the show, very fairy tale. Puts the Doctor in a situation that the predecessor could have done. Yeah, I mean, again, a bit like Chris Chibnall wanting Peter Capaldi to continue. There was plans, I believe, for David Tennant to continue into season 5. And so I could definitely have seen the 10th Doctor take on Prisoner Zero. I think that would have done really well. Allowing the audience to connect with the Doctor, you really connect with the 11th Doctor in this story. He's amazing. You see his kind nature. You see a little bit of manipulation. You see the clown aspect that Patrick Troughton and all had, and the 7th Doctor had. He is really good. You see a slight darker tone to him as well, when he's threatening Prisoner Zero at the end. I love him. He's brilliant in this story through and through. If you want to see a good 11th Doctor story, just watch the 11th Hour. It is absolutely amazing. So you do connect really well, and I know audiences did connect well with him in the end after the episode aired. Balanced threat, yeah, Prisoner Zero, just a generic villain who's on the run. The Doctor needs to stop him, really. That's sort of what it goes, and typical end of the world situation, so perfect for a new Doctor. Nothing too extreme, something just enough for him to handle. So yeah, I like the 11th Hour. If I had to rate it out of 10, I'd probably give the 11th Hour like probably a 7 or an 8 out of 10. It is a very fun story and sets up all the concepts for season 5 up really well. So that's why it deserves to get the bronze medal and come in at number 3 on my list. So taking the silver medal spot at number 2 goes to my boy Tom Baker in the story Robot. So the 4th Doctor's post-regeneration story. And I think, you know, I mentioned it earlier in the video, Planet of the Spiders and Robot are so heavily intertwined. You could easily have had John Pertwee in Robot and it wouldn't have changed anything really. I mean, to be fair, the Doctor, you do get a bit of a different aspect to the Doctor in this, but I feel like the 4th Doctor in this story does sort of act a bit like the 3rd Doctor would have to a degree. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. But Robot is a fantastic story. Season 12 as a whole, this is my favourite season of all of Classic Who, if I'm being perfectly honest, probably. Debatably of all time, because I just love the TARDIS team of the 4th Doctor, Sarah and Harry. It's my favourite TARDIS team. But all the stories in this season are really, really good. Yes, even Revenge of the Cybermen. But I digress. So in terms of explaining regeneration, it does do it fairly well because you've got the character of the Brigadier. And the Brigadier at this point has seen the Doctor change. He's actually seen the Doctor change this time, but obviously he had to go through that with Troughton to Pertwee as well. So he's fully used to it. So he's able to sort of be our sort of guide really for it. But I will admit, they don't actually talk about the change very much. But obviously the Doctor does go through the, I am the Doctor, he looks in the mirror, he does the Ninth Doctor thing where he looks in the mirror, he looks at his hair, looks at his ears, looks at his nose, all sorts, to try and, gauge himself. So you do get that pretty well. Like I said, you definitely could have had John Pertwee in the story, so I don't even need to go over the predecessor thing. This is a unit story set on Earth. Yes, John Pertwee could have done this. There is a bit of a difference, obviously, between Tom Baker, because Tom Baker's Doctor is not as martial artsy as the Third Doctor is. He's more of I wouldn't say he's more of the gadget person, but he does have a more of a playful nature, so to speak. And I think that's really good with Tom Baker. and I do like that. So you do see the elements of the Fourth Doctor coming through. Yes, you can connect well with the Fourth Doctor in this story. You get to see the darker tones. You get to see the goofball. You get to see the clown. You get to see manipulation. You get to see a light-hearted nature. He has everything, the Fourth Doctor, in the story, and it is amazing. Balance threat, the K1 robot, or the Kettleman robot, fantastic. Such an iconic villain, the robot in this. It's everywhere for toys. It needs to return properly in the show. I think I would love to see another version of this. I think it would be brilliant, and it's such an iconic thing. I've spoken to people who aren't Doctor Who fans who've actually been able to identify the robot as being from Doctor Who because it's such an icon. It is unbelievable, fantastic story. Easily a story that I go back to rewatch all the time, really. I've watched Robot. I've lost track how many times I've watched it. It's fantastic. So that's why it gets number 2 on the list, taking the silver medal. You've finally made it to number 1 on the list, and this might surprise some people, but coming in at number 1 on the list for my favourite post-regeneration story, it goes to Deep Breath from Season 8, the post-regeneration story for Peter Capaldi's 12th Doctor. Yes, I really like Deep Breath on multiple layers. I'm glad they did it almost movie length so they could really hammer home the change, really. Because this has got a bit of everything. You've got the conflict with the companion who knows about regeneration but misses the previous incarnation, and so needs that reminder about what regeneration is. So you get Clara explaining regeneration. You get Vastra explaining regeneration to Clara to remind her that it's still the Doctor, but he has to change his appearance in order to save himself. You've got the Doctor reminding the audience about that he is the same person, constantly reminding us, but he had to change, I love the scenes in like the diner where the Doctor says, like, if I hadn't changed my face, would you be cross? Almost like connecting with us as an audience who might not have taken to Peter Capaldi initially and are missing Matt Smith. And I love all those conversations like that. I also like the touch at the end that the 11th Doctor phones Clara in the TARDIS. So the previous incarnation phones saying, this new guy is the Doctor. You're going to love him. Please give him a chance. Please help him along. I think that is brilliant. And again, hammers home the point that he is still the Doctor. And that is the point for audiences. The Doctor says it to Clara when Clara says, you shouldn't have been listening to my phone call, pretty much. And he's like, I didn't need to because that was me talking. And you look at me and you can't see me. It's almost like, I am Matt Smith standing right here. Why can't you see that? I have all his memories. I have all his thoughts. I am him. That is me. Just because I don't look like him anymore doesn't mean it's not me. And I love stuff like that. And I think that is brilliant. In terms of explaining regeneration, yes, it does. Because like I said, Clara explains it in a poor way because she's bitter and is hurt that she's lost Matt Smith. But Vastra explains it. The Doctor explains it. Even Missy at the end, good old Missy, Michelle Gomez, she sort of explains it where she says about how she likes his new voice and she thinks she might keep it. So you've got all these people explaining what regeneration is. So there's constant reminders. We've even got hints to a previous story where the Doctor notices his face and thinks, I've seen this before. Why did I choose it? Which we find out is from the Fires of Pompeii back in season 4 with David Tennant. Would the previous incarnation have been able to deal with this? Yeah, I think the Matt Smith Doctor could have done it, because this also features the Paternoster gang with Vashta, Jenny and Strax, which the 11th Doctor worked quite heavily with them, so I think it would have worked out quite well. Would he have solved it as quickly as 12 did? I think 12 did solve the mystery quite quickly, to be fair, and he did it a lot on his own, really. He went off and did it all on his own, whereas Matt Smith would have had to have assistance, I think. So I don't know. I'm a bit hit or miss on that one. Do you get to connect with this new Doctor? Yes, you do. But obviously, a bit like Colin Baker, you would have been a bit taken aback because he's a lot more darker. He does a lot more undoctory things, but then makes up for it later. Like he leaves Clara hanging at the mercy of the clockwork droids, in a bit of a cruel way, which did give me hints of Colin Baker in Twin Dilemma, but he didn't fully leave her in the lurch. It was just all part of his plan. So a bit of Sylvester McCoy there manipulating the situation to gain an advantage. So it is very, very good. In terms of a balanced threat, yeah, the Clockwork Droids are easy. And especially for this incarnation of the Doctor, he is very dark and manipulative, especially season 8, 12th Doctor. Season 10, Capaldi sort of takes more of an approach of like the second Doctor, really. He's a bit more light-hearted, Peter Davison-esque, but there is still that darker nature to him. But yeah, I really love Deep Breath. So for me, it had to get top spot on the list for my post-regeneration stories. But that is it. That is my list of ranking all of the post-regeneration stories from worst to best, in my personal opinion. And keep that in mind, this is just my opinion. If you have a different list to me, that is totally okay, and I would love to hear it. If you did enjoy this video, please like it by giving it a thumbs up and comment down below your thoughts on this video and your thoughts on what your post-regeneration stories list would be. What are your top 3? And subscribe if you are new. But for now, this is the Nerdy Grail signing off. I hope you had an amazing day, and I will see you all next time. Bye for now, everyone.